So we are here today to have a really great conversation about youth organizing and leadership. I think one of the main reasons we wanted to actually have this kind of conversation, especially around both the gun control movement and the climate action movement, um, actually, yeah, there's been a lot of really strong youth leadership in both, right? Especially with the March for Our Lives, and even with the work that iMatter is. So I want to introduce our speakers. We have Karen and we have Akila. So I'm gonna let you guys introduce yourselves really quickly. But I will say, so Karen is actually a youth leader with iMatter. So that's really exciting. And she also is part of the high school Dems. So that is a really interesting intersection for the work that we do. And so she's not only been involved in this climate action work, but she's also been involved with, work around immigration and also what we want to talk about today, gun control and gun violence in the US. And then Akila, she is actually a former iMatter youth leader back in a little while ago, but right now she's working as the All Free organizer with the Power Shift Network. So I'm going to throw it to Karen first, just, maybe introduce yourself, anything you want to add really quickly, that would be great.
Sorry, I was on mute. I totally did. But hi guys, I'm Karen. First, I want to apologize because I actually just got back from the dentist, so I have like a weird numb thing going on my face. So sorry about that. But yeah, I'm Karen. I'm the diversity director for the High School Democrats of America, and I also just started as a facilitator here at iMatter, and I'm loving it so far. So yeah, super excited to talk to you guys. I'm from Colorado, so yeah.
Thanks. And Kayla, if you could just introduce yourself and a bit of the work actually that you're doing.
Yeah, happy to do that. I'm originally from New Mexico, although I now live in Minnesota, so Four Corners represent. It's good to meet you, Karen, and good to meet everybody else. I see some familiar faces and a lot of folks I don't know. So yeah, my name's Akila. As Jackie mentioned, I was involved in iMatter when I was in high school about 6 years ago, and I am now working for a small national group called the Power Shift Network that supports young people involved in climate justice work. And specifically, I work on pipeline resistance within that, so supporting young people who are stopping oil infrastructure in their communities. And iMatter is one of the partner organizations of the Power Shift Network, one of our member orgs. So super happy to be here today. Oh, and I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where it is finally starting to be summer out. It's really exciting.
Yes, it is. Actually a little hot to hit the 80s today. Yeah, so cool. I guess before I kind of dive into these questions, I just want to state this is more of a conversation between all of us. So I have some guiding questions, but please feel free if you have some questions you want to ask, just chat them to me, either publicly or you can privately chat them to me, but please feel free to just send them my way and we'll work them into the conversation. Yes, it was a blizzard in Minneapolis 2 weeks ago, just for reference. So it's been a little intense. Yes. Great. I guess I just want to start off. Again, thank you guys for joining us today. So I want to ask, I think everyone has like or we always think like, people have like a start of like what got you into organizing, right? And so I want to ask, what got you both into organizing? And Karen, not maybe like what got you really into organizing around like gun control and gun violence, and Akila around climate action.
Yeah, so what got me involved in organizing as a whole is my family, my parents, both of them are actually from Mexico, so they were immigrants, and for a really long time, they were actually undocumented. So I got to experience what the immigration system in the United States is like and kind of how unfair it can be at times as well. But on the gun control issue, I actually grew up in a pretty crazy neighborhood where it wasn't the safest place. I remember when I was in middle school, I was outside of my house and I had just, for some weird reason, I had stepped outside and right in front of my face, like 2 seconds later, I saw gun violence, and that's how it is for a lot of people, especially in minority communities and minority neighborhoods. So that's kind of what, I guess, drove me to gun violence and trying to stop it.
Awesome. So I got started when I was in high school, and the first group that I remember like really getting involved with was a youth leadership organization called Roots and Shoots, which was started by Dr. Jane Goodall. And to me, it was like I got involved with that because I was really looking for a group that I thought like worked toward real change and did more than just collecting recycling from high school classrooms, which was about all I'd been able to be involved in before that. And I remember sitting at a table at some summer fair, and having this epiphany that somehow, like by the simple act of joining this group, I had gone from like your average everyday like high school student to somebody who had some level of agency and leadership and like morphed into one of those ultra cool kids on the other side of the table who was like doing real stuff and like a part of the world and a part of the movement and able to do things. And I think it was that sense of like agency and leadership that kind of compelled me to feel like it was reasonable to take on organizing an event for 350.org's first International Day of Action around climate change in 2009. And I was 15 at the time and had heard quite a bit about the climate crisis, but I feel like for a lot of young people, it kind of got couched in between like, you know, your generation, you young folks should, you know, clean your room, do your homework and solve the climate crisis. And I'd never really been given the tools to do anything about it. So when 350.org had this International Day of Action, I really jumped onto that idea, and it felt like something with my newfound sense of like ability to create change in the world that I could jump in on. And so I jumped into doing that and managed to organize an event that had just over 100 people who took like an icon, one of the pictures with the number 350 in it that were really iconic from some of those early actions. And I feel like one of the most important parts of that was just getting to meet folks who were real life organizers, who taught me how to phone bank and basic skills like that. And also that this was something that I could learn to do. Like this was an actual activity that people were engaged in all over the world, and a skill set that I could learn. So bounced through a variety of organizations, including iMatter. And now really, I guess the climate movement has been a big part of my life for about 8.5 years now.
Wow, that is amazing. Thank you both. So I think actually, Karen, you mentioned something really interesting that I'd like to talk about just really quickly, because you mentioned, you know, coming from being a person of color, right? And this is something that I've thought about a lot as well. You know, talking about how do we get into these movements, or like how these movements have like been going on and like started, and like how do we like build connections to where the movements have already been. And so Michaela, you mentioned that you found the organizations and you tapped into them. And so Karen, I'd just like to hear a little bit more about, have you been able to tap into, you know, and you're already an iMatter leader in terms of like gun violence, you know, how has it been to tap into the organizations that already exist around these issues, but also, you know, how it's been like actually seeing, you know, the recent, you know, March for Our Lives movement, and like how people of color have really been positioned, or like, yeah, in this space, in this particular time, because it is an interesting time. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the times minorities kind of get shunned out of these movements, maybe not on purpose, but it does end up happening a lot of the times. And it's really important for us to just invite these people, because sometimes they feel that their voice maybe isn't as important, or that what they're going to do doesn't make a real impact. So, I mean, for me, luckily, it wasn't the hardest thing. I was able to tap into these movements, and I was, you know, welcomed in open arms. I know iMatter welcomed me with open arms. High School Dems. I'm really lucky because these young movements are very opening and welcoming to everybody, and it's awesome to be able to see, you know, young people and, you know, the millennials and everybody kind of join together, and, you know, everybody wants to hear everybody's voices. They don't want to shun anybody out. So it's been awesome, and I've had a very, I guess, lucky experience, but I know for a lot of people it isn't always like that, and they can get shunned out, or their voice isn't as important, or they're made to feel that way. So.
Cool, thank you. And then, so I guess, you know, one thing you mentioned, and Akela, I actually want to pose this question to you because it's interesting. You've had a very climate action and climate focus career around organizing. And so Karen, yours is a little bit more on surface, multifaceted, but it's really interesting to think about. Like we always talk about like self-care and like burnout. Like activist burnout is like really real for anyone, right? And so, Michaela, how do you like support and interact with other movements without completely burning out? Because I'll be honest, sometimes I look on Facebook or Twitter and I'm like, yeah, it's time to nap for 5 hours because this is intense. But yeah.
That is definitely super real. And the first thing I'll say is like, go nap for 5 hours. Like, do that. Sleep is important. I feel like, especially within activism and especially youth activism, I think we sometimes get into this like Olympics of burnout kind of situation where everyone's like comparing, well, you know, I only slept like 3 hours last night and this is so intense. And like, there is so much good to be done in the world and there will always be so much more work to do. And the fact that there are so many things happening all the time is a testament to the good work that people are doing, and consistently depriving ourselves of sleep or food or time with the people that we love and care about isn't gonna help us in the long run. So like, I'll just put that out there first of like, those things are so important. And at least for me, like that's ultimately what I'm fighting for, is the people that I care about and the beauty that I see in the world and the just absolutely incredible communities and art and food and music and places and species that exist. And if I didn't take time to celebrate that as well as protect it, then I don't think I would be authentically doing this work and doing my best work. And I think that part of doing climate justice work or doing work in any movement and trying to build some of those connections across movements and across different issue areas really comes down to relationship building. And so I know that for me, a lot of the work I do in stopping oil pipelines is hand in hand with Indigenous communities. And so I try to prioritize, like sometimes I won't go to, say a climate specific lobby day at the Capitol, but I'll go to an art show that some of the Indigenous youth leaders in this work are holding. So not having to be everywhere, but picking like, what are the relationships that are most important to us, that are the people that we think we're going to be in this fight and in this struggle alongside. And I guess like the last thing there is, especially as someone who carries a lot more privilege and someone who's white and of settler background, knowing that the work that I do in partnership with Indigenous communities, I think it's really easy for folks to get into this mentality of thinking you need some sixth sense or 3 degrees or 4 training programs in order to work with people who are different than you. And that's not true. We are all humans, and building those relationships is something that everyone is more than well endowed enough to do. And the other part of that is just like knowing that I'm going to stick my foot in my mouth sometimes. Like I'm gonna trip up, I'm gonna make mistakes, and that is like not the end of the world and not something to fear, but to be aware of and be conscious and humble in that moment. And so I guess that's like how I approach trying to build those authentic relationships and friendships.
Yeah, thank you. That's dope. Yeah, and then Kara, so I guess from like, because it's interesting because you do have like these different areas that you work in, like that I really admire, right? And so like, how do you take care of yourself, or how do you make sure you aren't burnt out, because you are going from like, you know, one thing to another? And of course, like everything is like interrelated. Like our struggles are not like disconnected by any means, but you know, there is that balance that you have to have, and in a way that I think is very different. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, being a young organizer is so hard because you have, you know, your school, and then you have like other activities. Like I did mock trial in high school, and I'm a graduating senior, so I had like college applications and scholarship applications, and it was tough. I'm not gonna lie, there was times where I was like, why do I even do this? Like, I'm so tired all the time. Like, I just want to have like, I want to be like almost like normal, you know, like go out with my friends and do like normal high school stuff. But I think just, you know, taking time for yourself is obviously so important, but I know that something that always boosts me up and makes me want to keep going and keep running and keep fighting the good fight is, I guess, just going into these communities that I know I'm kind of, you know, helping and making a difference in, and seeing their reactions. I know I have a story from the fall where it was right around finals week, and I was starting to get so tired and I just wanted a break, and I was so unmotivated, and I had just finished studying, and I still had to do another project for the Colorado Latino Leadership Advocacy Center. And I wrote it up. I was so tired, but I stayed up and I finished it, and I was super happy that I was done with it. And then the next day, after it was presented, I wasn't there because I was taking my final, but it was presented to a group of Latinos. I made it in both English and Spanish because I am bilingual, and these were undocumented folks. And I remember after it was presented, the person who had presented it called me, and she was like, they loved it. They were taking photos, like of every slide. They would go and take their photos. And that just made my heart so happy, because it was like I was complaining all night about having to do it, but then it was so worth it after. And I think that's so important, for us to kind of get a realization of that the work that we're doing matters and it's important.
Yeah, that's amazing. And really quickly, I just want to remind folks, please, send questions in through chat. We can make this like a conversation between all of us. That'd be amazing. But I want to pivot just a little bit, because I think one of the biggest things about why these topics were chosen is this is a really interesting moment in history right now. So we have in the US, we have a very interesting federal government that we're processing and working through in all of our work, whether it's related to climate or to gun control and action. And so I think that's really, a lot of people are inspired in this moment, and from my perspective. And I would love to know, based on the organizing that you guys do, right? What has changed? What shifts have you noticed? And especially especially for you, Karen, but even Akela, for you, because I think we're around the same age. I was in high school in 2009 as well. And so, seeing this shift has been interesting for me as well. So I would love to know, what are your thoughts around this moment in history and the work that we're doing?
Do you want me to go first on that one, or Karen, do you want to go for it? All right. I'm getting pointed at. Cool. So I think, we could all go on for hours, I'm sure, about all the things that are absolutely upside down and topsy-turvy about this moment in history. And I know for a lot of folks that centers on the election of Trump as our president in 2016, and that was a really major moment. And for me, the Trump election came also on the heels of the peak of the Dakota Access Pipeline fight and the crisis at Standing Rock. That was a really big part of kind of what was in my worldview and what was happening that I was paying attention to. And I feel like both of those kind of drove a massive influx of people into, especially pipeline resistance work, but into the streets for the Women's March and into movement spaces. And one of the conversations that was really interesting to me that came out of that was, there's this whole wave of people who are awakening to the forces of racism and exploitation, and the fact that those things that we were seeing were kind of the outcomes of business as usual. So there, this new wave of folks having that awakening moment around that and wanting to plug in. And then the folks who have been in these struggles for years saying it's great to have you, but where were you before? And having some of this conversation around that, Trump wasn't something that came out of nowhere. Standing Rock wasn't something that came out of nowhere. These are the symptoms of systems that we've built over hundreds of years that need to change. And so I think recognizing that and seeing a lot of folks coming together around that. And I think some of the things with the March for Our Lives as well, that these are problems that are so deeply rooted in our society that have these outcomes, and that young people and elders actually both have the wisdom to address these. And we're starting to see a shift in society toward rediscovering the wisdom that young people and elders have. Again, going back to Standing Rock was started by a group of young people, high school and kind of, just out of high school age folks, with the wisdom of their elders, to start the camps that happened out there. And I know or at least I feel like in my experience, our society really prioritizes that the folks we should look to for answers are the middle-aged folks who have worked their way up to a position of power within our economic structure. So being in charge of a company or having a lot of prestige or money. And that because of this, the ways that society is skewed and the privilege it offers folks, that's usually middle-aged, middle-class white men. And so starting to look and say that the answers actually aren't just concentrated there, that there are young people who have the answers. You know, no one's ever built a climate justice movement before. I know that was important to me getting involved at like age 15. I was like, well, my ideas are just as good as the, 80-year-old sitting next to me, because like he's never done this either. So we're just going to start from scratch and figure this out. And so I feel like, especially in this moment of like people realizing that society kind of needs a large scale overhaul in the way that we arrange power, and that we think about our relationships to each other and to money and to our value systems and to the natural resources on our planet, people are really starting to recognize that maybe the answers aren't where we've been looking.
Cool. And Karen, before you answer the question really quickly, I want to throw one more quick thing in there, do you know, in addition to all of that, right, do you actually think, I think I like kind of made the assumption that there's a youth movement emerging. Do you actually think that that's happening, like across like a traditional issues line? Like, do you feel like that's something happening, Because it could be, but yeah.
Yeah, so I absolutely do think that, because I remember in 2015, after Trump had given his speech that he was going to run for president, I had no idea what it meant to be a Republican or a Democrat. And I think I was freshman about to be sophomore. And I went out and I bought a book on, what you need to know about the Democratic and the Republican Party. And I made the decision for myself, and I had no idea what it meant at all. Like, I didn't know what it was to be a liberal or a conservative or, libertarian. And I had to learn all on my own. I never learned it in any government classes. And I know that's how it is for a lot of, high schoolers right now, is they're learning what it means. And before, they didn't care about it. They didn't take interest. I know my oldest sister, she's 25 years old. When she was in high school, she didn't know anything that was going on in the political world. She didn't really start to get into it, into politics or, political issues until Trump. And although, Trump hasn't been the awesomest president, he has brought something to us. He has brought awareness to us, like what's going on in the country. We're all paying attention constantly because of him. But most importantly, young people are starting to pay attention. We have Twitter and Facebook, which gives us this easy and quick access to the political world and what's going on around the country. So I definitely do think that young people are building this movement because we are watching and we are paying attention. I remember February 14th when the Stoneman Douglas shooting happened. I was so sad, but I was thinking, I wonder if it's just going to be the same thing again. Nothing's going to change. Everybody's just going to go on with their lives. But luckily, we had these young people who they didn't want it to be the same. So they got up and they changed because they had been paying attention to what had been going on before. So I definitely do think that there's a movement going on, and I'm so hopeful that it will keep happening and things will continue to change and people will begin to listen to young people.
Thank you. That's amazing. And, it's interesting that, Akila, you brought up like this relationship or like the fact that like in some spaces, this work has already been happening. Like people have been building it together, and that like really quickly reminds me of the pipeline issue in Canada right now. And tell me if I'm not remembering the name correctly, Lily, but the Kinder Morgan pipeline, is that the correct name?
Kinder Morgan,
sorry. But that's a huge pipeline issue. And just like when you talk about, thinking about like how these issues are like coming to forefront and we're like really paying attention to them in a way that's much more intentional now. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Like I can see that connection happening. Yeah. And so I guess, as you mentioned, like working with elder folks as well, that's another question I had, right? Like, how has like that relationship building process been? Because in some spaces it's been really strong, but also, sometimes it can be a bit challenging, or, we can run into tensions as well. So I would love to know more about like what that experience has been like for y'all, and, like some successes and also like some challenges that you've had to work through in your organizing work. And Akila, I'm going to throw it back to you.
All right, cool. First off, if anyone wants to see a super inspiring story, go check out the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline Resistance. They have done just absolutely incredible organizing in Canada around stopping. It's one of the 3 main tar sands pipelines that are proposed right now, along with Keystone XL and then Line 3 here in Minnesota. And after doing about 3 weeks of rolling arrests outside the gates of Kinder Morgan and along the route, the company suddenly decided maybe they would revisit some of their life choices. So just saying, resistance works, y'all. But getting back to Jackie's question, so I don't totally derail us talking about pipelines for the rest of this hour. I mean, I'll start off just by saying I love intergenerational organizing, and I feel like I actually had an enormous culture shock when I went from community organizing as a high school student to college campus organizing, working with only folks my age. And I love being able to talk with folks who were arrested protesting Vietnam, the Vietnam War and nuclear weapons, and getting the recipes for vegan lasagna and having that kind of community to be a part of. But I think for me, and I saw this especially with some of the March for Our Lives publicity recently, one of the hardest things for me to see is when an adult tells a young person, like, you give me hope and your generation is going to solve this. Because to me, that's always felt like making a 15-year-old responsible for an adult's emotional well-being. Like it's the youngest generation's responsibility to keep the adults in our society feeling hopeful and motivated, and that we need to remind them that everything is going to be okay. And that always felt really unfair to me and really hard. And it's also, again, I kind of mentioned earlier, I felt like growing up, solving the climate crisis and a lot of the other societal problems that we face was kind of put on the youngest generation as like, this is just one of your responsibilities and good luck. And no, we don't have any of the answers. That's why we're relying on you. And so I feel like, again, with like the recent marches, rather like what I would rather hear adults saying, and like what I encourage, especially as I've like started to cross that line, and I'm very cognizant of the fact, like, I am, I still consider myself a young person, but I'm no longer in college, and I'm kind of starting to straddle that line. So talking with my adult peers as opposed to my youth peers about this, asking them to say things like, wow, we need to support these young people and keep putting our knowledge and money and time into helping them pave the way. So I feel like, I guess I'll stop there.
Yeah, so working with the older generation is always super fun, but I'm not gonna lie, I have had some, I guess, not problems, but just negative times. I remember when the High School Democrats of America first started as an organization. We were still a baby organization, we're brand new. But when we first started, people didn't really take us seriously. I remember, older folks, they were like, well, why should we support you? Like, high schoolers don't care about these issues. Like, there's just kind of like a handful of you who care. So we're not going to put our resources into your organization. And I remember that was like really hard. And it was like, wow, because there was a lot of us who cared. And now fast forward a few years later, there's, over 500 chapters in the United States of the high school Dems. So, we proved that, yeah, we do care actually. And now they're starting to listen to us now, they're putting their resources into us, which has been fantastic. And especially with this March for Our Lives movement that has started, a lot of people are starting, especially older people, are starting to take notice of the power that young people have and the motivation that they have to, change these issues and get involved in the conversation. So although there's super positive times that we've had, with the older generation, sometimes they also can doubt us and doubt our work, which is unfortunate.
Thanks. And I guess so, those hard times come with any relationship that you like have in life, right? And so I guess, but the work has to go on. We have to keep moving forward, and we have to like work through those tensions. So how do you guys, how do you like build, how do you find, how can we find each other? Like, how can youth leaders and elders find each other? And how do we like actually start building those relationships? Like, what has worked for you guys in your organizing?
Karen, you want to go first this time?
Yeah, sure, I can go first. So I think what has helped, I think I'm kind of luckier, probably because The Democratic Party actually does, that's most of the work that I've been doing for these past few years. And the Democratic Party actually has a much older, generation. They're a very old party. I know whenever I go to like community events that they hold, it's very much like people that are in their 50s or 60s, although sometimes there are, 30s and 20s. But I think just going to those events, and also I know I've invited a lot of them to the young people's events, because I think it's important to include everybody, no matter their age or their race or their culture, to invite them to come and join us, because we're all in this together and we're all working toward the common goal, of goodness. So, yeah.
That's awesome. I just want to ditto everything Karen just said, especially around building communities with people. I think that's a really big part of it, is building up the relationships with folks so that you feel, so that you have both the support systems and the peers that, to support us in this work. And I guess the thing that came to mind for me most immediately when you were asking that question, Jackie, was around just young people kind of owning our power, in the sense that it means we know we have a stake in this, and not being afraid to be upfront about that. I hear a lot of adults honestly lecturing young people on how this is about their future, even when those young people are already leading the way. And it always kind of makes me roll my eyes and chuckle a little bit. Yeah, I think they got the memo. They organized this event that you're at. You don't need to tell them this is about their futures. They just said that. And I'll just use a quick example, which is one of the stories I've been most excited and inspired to be a part of, which is about the Youth Climate Interveners. It's this group of 13 young people, high school, college, just out of college age in Minnesota, who came together, who are already involved in organizations like iMatter. One of them is involved in iMatter, and other local climate and racial justice organizations here in Minnesota. And they came together to work on stopping this Line 3 pipeline. And what they did is they actually asked the judge who's presiding over this entire permitting case that the pipeline's going through right now. They asked if they could have a seat at the table based on the fact that the climate crisis that this pipeline was perpetuating was going to jeopardize them first and foremost, and have direct impacts on each of them. And all sat down and wrote down, I have pre-existing mental health conditions and climate change is going to exacerbate that, or I come from a low-income community and I'm not going to be able to afford the increases in the electricity and utility bills and food prices, or I'm in, for some of the indigenous youth, that this pipeline was going to go through their traditional wild rice and treaty lands. And the judge actually recognized that and said, yeah, all right, you're in, have a seat at the table. And this group of 13 young people, again, half of them are in high school. I'll be honest, I'm a little biased, but they ran circles around some of the paid lawyers in this case and put together expert witnesses and arguments, and they were in there asking questions that the oil company couldn't answer. And I know before they got started, I had someone who was in the pipeline movement say to me, young people are great and all, but, really it's the landowners and some of the indigenous leaders who are really, really stopping this thing. And I just, I like young people and I want them there, but I think they mostly just show up as crowd numbers, we need them to show up in numbers, and they're good at that, but I don't really know what else. I don't know where they fit. I don't know what their stake is. And I think being really articulate and upfront and telling people we do have a stake in this and we're here to fight for it, whether that's the climate crisis or gun violence or, or equal rights in other ways, whether that's LGBTQ issues or gender issues or so many other parts of this movement, being able to articulate that we have a stake in this and we're here to fight for it ourselves and don't need folks to say that for us is a really big part of it. So finding those platforms.
Wow, that is amazing. Thank you both for that. That was really mind blown right now. Yeah. So I guess I want to shift a little bit again. So we've been talking about in general youth organizing and youth activism, but I want to talk a little bit more about the actual issues of gun violence and climate action and climate work right now, because for me personally, they're very prominent. They're things I think about often, but I would love to hear from both of your perspectives, right? where are there similarities in these issues, and where are the obvious differences? Because you could do a lot with that. Yeah. So I'm gonna throw it to Karen again really quickly. Yeah.
So I think one of the obviously number one similarity is that it affects all of us, you know. One thing that the environmental, you know, the climate problem that's happening, it affects all of us. Everybody is affected in one way or another. And that's something that people don't always realize, that they're also going to be affected by this. So that's, you should care because you're going to be affected, but also your neighbor's going to be affected, and your uncle's going to be affected, and your daughter's going to be affected, you know. So, and same thing with the gun violence issue, you know, everybody's affected. We're all, you know, living this together, and we're all, you know, battling this together, because you could be the next victim, you know, hopefully not, obviously, but like anybody could be the next victim of gun violence. So that's kind of the one similarity is we're all in it together. Difference is obviously, the number one difference I see is that the climate issue is such like a difficult issue, because it can't be fixed like that. You know, you can't just throw legislation and the next day it's going to be fixed. It's something that's going to take years to fix, and, you know, generations to come are going to have to deal with this issue. And as for the gun violence issue, it's something that also can't be immediately fixed, but also we can work towards it and eventually fix it. So.
Again, I totally want to just second what Kara just said, that to me, one of the big differences is how intangible the climate crisis is, and how immediate and visual and often graphic the gun violence crisis is in this country. I think one of the similarities is the amount of money being poured into opposing solutions to either one. But whereas that's been, I think, just lobbying against basic straightforward legislation on gun issues, with the climate crisis, that's been like a disinformation and doubt sowing campaign, which is also more difficult, I think, in some ways to grapple with. It's like the problem is more intangible, and the efforts to oppose it, or to oppose action, are also more intangible. So I know that's like one thing that comes to mind for me in thinking about how they're similar and how they're different. And I think, Karen, you're totally on point with saying like both of them affect so many people, and making the climate crisis, taking the ways in which it's going to impact us, and making those personal too, has been a big part of like what I try to focus on. And it's one reason I'm involved in pipeline resistance work, was when I was looking at like the climate crisis in general, taking on the oil industry in the most direct and tangible way possible seemed like the best use of my time. And I know with the March for Our Lives and some of the amazing high school organizing that's been going into that, I've heard some of the older folks in the climate movement saying, "Oh, wow, these young organizers are great. Can we get them to work on climate?" And like reminding them that, yeah, the young folks who are leading the March for Our Lives are also fighting pipelines, and also fighting against missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is like one of the places where I see like gun violence and domestic violence really directly overlapping with pipeline resistance and the fossil fuel industry, that those things often go hand in hand. And reminding kind of often the older folks in the room, not always, but that these things are the most similar and overlap the most in certain communities. And that those are often the ones who are doing the most to try and fix them.
Oh, yeah, no, that is, y'all are really dope. Yeah. So yeah, I guess, okay, we are doing a lot. Young folks are like doing a lot. How do we support young organizers like you both to really, like, how do we support each other, but also like what does support look like in our communities and like in these like movements? Like, how do we do that? Because there's so much overlap and like we're taking on a lot. So yeah. And that can be like, so I will say like, that can be like, you know, like overarching, like, what does that look like? But also like personally, like, what does that look like for you, Karen? What does that look like for you, Akela? Like, yeah, like not even thinking about overarching, just like on a day-to-day basis, if you're having a rough day, what can I do, you know, or what can someone in this like group do, you know, to like maybe offer support?
I think just, you know, I know with iMatter, I can always go to, Megan or Rebecca or anybody. I can go to anybody in this organization and say, hey, I'm feeling a little bit dried out. And I know that they'll always, understand and help me through it. That's what I love so much about iMatter. And same thing goes for almost all the organizations, that you'll work for. They'll always understand, but most importantly, they'll help you get through it and help, they'll give you that downtime, but then after when you come back, they'll get you motivated again. And that's just one of the number one things that's so great about having a support system is that, and especially a support system that also organizes, because they understand how difficult it can be and how everybody needs their downtime. And they're willing to pick you back up as soon as, you're ready to go again. So I think just, I guess, being there and having people who understand is number one.
Yeah, totally. I feel like reminding each other that each of us bring just absolutely incredible and unique gifts to this work. Everybody's thought process and skill set, no matter how tangible or intangible that is amazing and so needed and so helpful and so beautiful. And also that no one is going to do this 24/7, 365 days a year for the rest of their lives. And that we're going to have to pass that work back and forth and kind of pass the baton and shift the weight back and forth as people have other things in their lives that they need to pay attention to, whether that's for an afternoon or a day or a week or a year, and that you can jump back in and kind of, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. That's a really important reminder, and one I find myself like making sure to articulate to people often and like asking to have reiterated back. I just lost the rest of my train of thought. I'll stop there.
No, that's great. Definitely giving us gems. So I guess those were all the questions I had and that people sent in. So thanks for everyone for sending questions in. Does anyone have any other questions they'd like to ask at this moment?
If not, I'll buy you a second because I remembered my train of thought. Came back to the station. I'll make it super quick. I was just going to say the other thing that keeps me going is looking back at examples from throughout history, the well-known ones, the less well-known ones. And maybe that's because I'm a little bit of a history nerd, but looking at the movements that people have run with before and the amount of change that they've achieved, and also like how long it's taken them. And that if you have to fail 9 times out of 10 before you win, such as with pipelines and with legislation and with so many other things, every time someone says, this march isn't changing anything, I say, well, look at your textbooks. You're right that it was the legislation that passed that fixed it, but you know what the picture next to it is of? Of a march. Or, the years and years that people poured into movements before they got those wins. And that's true across the globe, across time, across demographics, across all sorts of things that have happened. And so when I'm feeling down and just being like, man, I don't want to write another email and I don't want to go to another Minnesota Public Utilities Commission meeting for 3 hours in a windowless room, I'm like, how many people did this before me? And you know what they got out of it? Hell of a lot.
That's amazing. That is a really good reminder. Oh, man. No. Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you for doing this. Oh, did you have a question?
Me? Yeah. So I was just... So I remember earlier in the conversation, there was some talk about how intangible the climate crisis seems to be. Is there any way that you have found that is effective to help people, particularly people in urban inner city environments who have many more problems that are more up in their face, how to make that problem more visible, more tangible?
Yeah. I can actually answer that if you guys want me to. For a little bit context, I was born and raised in Chicago. So like very urban. I went to school downtown Chicago for high school. So, I was in a city, right? And so when people think about Chicago, they think about a lot of different issues, right? Some valid, some not. But I think one of the biggest things that was mentioned earlier is like building relationships with people is so critical. I think just like not just like trying to say like this is an issue you have to think about, right? Because it is something to think about. And even when I go home and I talk to my family members, this isn't on the forefront of their mind, but like I'm constantly in conversation with them about like, okay, like, yes, this is important. Like, yes, like I know we are dealing with like personally in my family's community, like police brutality, XYZ is happening, but also like this is how this is all connected. And so I find that like making like not being like judgmental, because I used to be that way, I'll be honest about it. I used to be real judgmental, but I realized like that's not going to work, right? But then also like realizing like there are actually like a lot of cool like ways to incorporate like this like work or this like climate action into like everyday life, right? So like even talking to my family about recycling, what works, what doesn't work, or connecting like pipeline issues to Chicago. Like for instance, in our governor's race, like one of the candidates, he supported like the Dakota Access Pipeline, like he did. And like, so making those connections and like really doing the research and being like, yo, like we're all connected. If he's doing that over here, like imagine what he's gonna do here, and like having those really personal conversations, because it definitely is on people's minds. We all have a lot that we're thinking about, but if you can sit and like really just make those conversations and always be in conversation with folks about stuff, that's what I found has been really effective, especially when I go home and I talk to like my 80-year-old grandma. like yeah, so I hope that answers your question a little bit. Cool. Yeah. Oh, really quickly, integrating arts into organizing. Do either of you kind of have thoughts or perspectives on that really quickly? If not, that's fine. I can answer as well.
Megan seemed excited about that.
I'm so excited about that.
Yeah. You want to?
Where am I?
Okay. So this is like becoming me talking about my life. So when I was in college, I actually I did. So this is funny, Kayla. I don't know if you know Sean. I was in a summer like art program with them. They are also like part of the PowerShip staff. So, yeah. So and it was an interesting time in my life. But I think art. One thing when you talk about building connections between movements, art is a great way to do that. Like to have something there to like visualize that is so powerful. And so like I was doing screen printing and stuff like that, but I think it's just like one of the ways to like, again, building community and relationships with folks. Art is a way to do that. And so I have a lot of thoughts about art and stuff, but yeah, we should do a call about that. That's really interesting. Thank you for that question. Yeah, so I think in the future, we are definitely going to plan like a conversation around art and movements because it's amazing. But yeah, oh, go ahead.
I'm just gonna jump in because I think, as we talk about what are the things that that get us through that burnout, that those moments of somebody truly connecting with us, that art as a form of expression of who we are and the future that we envision is so powerful, especially when a lot of our work involves those PUC meetings with no windows, and that it is, and I think Akila was talking about how we look to this sort of like the people who make a lot of money and who are like successful to sort of set the frame for how we work. And on the fringes of that is like where life is amazing and fun and beautiful and there's texture. And I know Akila was like specifically talking about like art builds around marches and the kind of community that builds, or just as a way of expressing how this affects you in your life, is just super. And I don't want to take up too much space, but like it's so powerful, and I so want us. I'm like, I have made a notation that we will have another call about this because it's so exciting.
To add on to that, and then I want to respect people's time, but
yes,
you were mentioning earlier, like, looking at back at history, right, to like keep us moving forward. Art is another form of history. I look back at my old artwork all the time. I don't even like do art that much anymore, but just like when I need like a moment, I literally travel around with like a box that's right next to me of like old artwork, and I just like remind myself, like when I feel down or like when I think that like I'm like, oh, I can't really do this, like I'm like, no, you've already like you've set the blueprint, just follow it. And that's why art is really it's really dope. Yeah, but cool. I thank you all for like these amazing questions and this amazing conversation. Karen and Keila, thank you so much. This was really wonderful. And I would encourage everyone to, you know, check out the High School DIMS, check out Power Shift Network, really cool. And yeah, we will send follow-up stuff, but thank you all for joining this call. It's really appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you so much for getting on.
Yeah, thank you guys.
And for all the incredible work I know y'all are doing. I want to like have an hour-long phone call listening to every single one of you.
Have a wonderful evening. Bye.